Hello everyone. In this video I'll tell you about some other useful Python modules that may come in handy as you're doing your development projects. Now this is just going to be a very brief introduction to these modules, but I'm going to point out to you where you can read further information online, both about these modules and other related ones that might come in useful for you. The first set of modules I'd like to tell you about allow us to read a web page and access some data from that web page. This might be extremely useful for you in development projects where you need to just rip data that's available online. Now typically the way to access data inside of a HTML string, which is what most web pages are represented as, is the built-in module xml.elementtree. So XML element tree is a module that just comes in with the Python standard library, but since this module has been around, people have developed a second module that has a much nicer interface called Beautiful Soup, and people tend to use Beautiful Soup to do the same thing that elementtree used to do. So for the purposes of today, I'm going to introduce you to Beautiful Soup. So let's see how this works. Now, Beautiful Soup is a package that you have to go and install separately from Python, but I've installed it, and here I'm importing Beautiful Soup. And the second thing I'm importing is the URL library. So this library allows me to put in a URL string and access the contents of that URL string. So that's what's happening in these first two lines. Here I'm opening a particular URL, and this URL that you see here is simply the documentation that gets displayed in my browser here. That's the elementtree documentation. This open command creates a file-like object, which I'm calling URL, and in the next step I'm getting all of the data out of that file, which comes out as a string. So let me cut-paste this, and we can see what it actually does inside of Python. So here it is. I've cut-pasted this code inside of Python, and we could take a look at the URL string at the end, and you can see that it's a long string of HTML code, and we can print it. And there it is. It looks a little bit nicer because the new lines are actually showing up. Now, of course, this is not that useful, but what I'd like to do is maybe go inside of this string and pull out the little pieces of data that are useful to me. So let's say that the little pieces of data that are useful to me are all these headers here, the XML tree elements, parsing XML, and so forth. Now, I've looked at the string, and I know that all of these headers appear inside of HTML tags that are header level 3 tags. And so in my code, what I'm going to do is first create a Beautiful Soup object out of that string. So that's what this first line here is doing. It's just going to create one of these Beautiful Soup objects. And then I'm going to find all the header level 3s inside of there. So let's take a look at that. And there it is. I created the Beautiful Soup object in this top line. And here I'm finding all the level header 3s, and it's printing out all the header 3 tags that it found inside of that whole document. Now, I don't want the tags themselves. The only thing that I want is the text inside of the tags. So let's change that with this next line. And here I'm just saying, go through all the header level 3 tags and extract the text from them. So let's see what that looks like. And now I get the various words like navigation, XML tree elements, parsing XML, and so forth. So as you saw, this was an extremely quick way for me to get all of the headers from that web page. And you can do this with more complex web pages that, for example, might have tables of data that you need to automatically download and use in your application. For more advanced querying capabilities, I encourage you to take a look at the XPath support in the XML elementtree module. So this allows you to write complicated queries using a language called XPath that's specifically created for querying XML type documents. So for example, here it says look for a neighbor tag that's within a country tag, or look for a tag that has an attribute called name that's equal to Singapore within the year tag, and so forth. So XPath gives you much more complex querying capabilities than the default ones available in Beautiful Soup. Of course, you can read a lot more about Beautiful Soup online, right here, it'll tell you about the various methods of accessing the data once you've downloaded it. But other related modules that you might find useful are the Internet Protocols module, so that's where URLlib comes from. There's other internet protocols that are automatically built into Python and you can use very easily. There's also the XML processing modules that are already included in Python, which you can find more information about here. So let's take a look at a few other useful modules in Python. The first one is sys, or the system module. And this is where you find things like argv, standard input, standard output, and standard error. So for those of you familiar with C or C++, you'll be very familiar with what these things mean. And you can also interact with Python's modules and path here. So let me just show you a little bit of what that looks like. So here is, I imported the sys module, and if I look at sys.path, it's a list of directories that Python looks through when it's trying to load a module. And so if you get an error that Python can't find a module, you can add a particular directory to this path variable, and then the next time you do import, Python will look through that additional directory when it's trying to import the module. Now, generally, even though sys.argv is a good way of reading the command line arguments to your program, in this particular case, the program was just IPython, and it got started with the -pylab argument. Even though this is one particular way of accessing the command line arguments, there's a much better built-in way of accessing the command line arguments. And I encourage you to read that, which is the Argparse module, and this is included in the standard library. And you should use that instead of sys.argv in general. The next useful module is the OS module, or operating system module. And this is where all of the POSIX style type functions live. Again, for those of you that don't know exactly what these are, this is the basic way of interacting with the underlying operating system. So you can do things like changing directories, listing directories, finding out information about various files, and so forth. And in particular, one thing that I found useful in the past is that you can give a starting directory and you can walk over all of the subdirectories that start in that starting directory. So that's os.path.walk. You can also execute other system commands with os.system. So let's do some examples of this. So here it is. I've imported the OS module, and I could do os.system and list things, and that lists all the files in the current directory. Now, literally what happened here is Python went out and it called the list command, which was a completely separate program on my computer, and took the outputs of that list command, and this is the string that's the output of the list command. But let's take a look at some other useful functionality. So for example, you could do the same thing with OS list directory, and you could say just list the current directory, which is what I did with that dot. And this gives all of the different files that are in my current working directory. So we have a bunch of PY files, some MPEGs, and some AVIs for videos such as the one that you're watching right now. You can also take a look at information about a particular file. So for example, this says, take a look at this special methods file that I have here. It is the special methods.py. And I want to find all the statistics that the operating system has on that file. And you get all kinds of information. For example, what user owns it, what group owns it, the file size, the modification time, the creation time, the access time, etc., etc., etc. And so there's lots and lots of other functions in the operating system module. I'm not going to cover them all here, but please read about them, because usually if there's something that you want to do with a file, likely the operating system module lets you do it. Some other useful things to know about operating system is that you can interact with other processes on the same computer with os.fork, os.exec, and os.pipeopen. Now, again, these are more complex functionalities, but what they do is they let you open an entirely other program and have your Python program interact with that other program as a sub-process. It's somewhat advanced functionality, but it might come in handy if you're building something complex. A related module that I found useful is the Glob Module, which lets you find all the files with a particular name in some directory. So just to give you an example, here I've imported the Glob Module and said, give me all of the files in the current directory that end on .py. And so these are all the files in the current directory that end on .py. And this can be useful for doing things like writing a script that takes all the .py files in a current directory and does some processing to them. The next really useful module is one to leave informative printing or logging statements in your program. So that's the logging module. And the first thing you have to do after you import the logging module is execute a basic configuration. Now this tells Python what level of messages to display. And in this example, what I'm saying is the level of messages I want is info or better. So here it is. I've imported logging. I've set the basic config is to info. And then I'm going to create a particular logging object. So that's with logging get logger. And you can put an arbitrary name here. And now I can start using that logger to basically write various messages to the screen. So if I do logger.info, what gets printed to the screen is this is an information message. It comes from the logger called module examples. That's this string that I provided here. And then this is the actual message. This is an info message. I could do logger.warning. This is a warning message. But if you do something like debug, and this is a debug message, that will not show up. So essentially, what this level does is it allows you to filter the informational messages to be more or less depending on the level specified here. So debug is a very low level. It'll print out a lot of information. Info is a little bit less information. Warning is a little bit less information. And there's also critical messages that could also get printed to the screen. So there's a lot more information about this that you can read in the logging how-to online in Python, and there's a link for it there. In terms of other useful modules, you're already a little familiar with Iterators. Use it to create interesting lists of things, repeating lists of things, products of lists, etc., etc. So Iterators is extremely useful. But another similar package that's useful is functools. So functools is useful for things like fixing a few arguments to a function and leaving the rest open for fixing later. So what you should read about here is functools.partial. And the last thing I want to tell you about is creating your own iterators. So here what I've done is just defined a function counter. It takes in a single parameter n. And I have a loop that's iterating from 1 to n. And inside of it, instead of using return, I'm using a different built-in word called yield. So let's see what happens here once I paste this function. If I call counter of 3, what gets returned is a generator object. So let's store that generator object. And you're already familiar with generators. We've seen this a little bit when working with pandas and Iterators. So if I do g.next, it's going to go through the various values of that generator. So 0, 1, 2, and then at the end it raises a stop iteration exception. So this is a way to create your own iterators, similar to the way that Iterators does this. So this is useful for things like walking through complex data structures, but for most simpler things, you can replace it by a call to Iterators. So use Iterators instead of this for simple things, but you might need this for if you're doing something more complex. And finally, what I'd like to leave you with is that it's really useful to look through the standard library. And what I mean here is you don't have to read everything. It's just useful to know what things exist, and then you can read more about them when you need them. So to give you an example, this is the documentation for the standard library. And I really encourage you to just spend half an hour or an hour doing things like this. just reading over the string services. And this is all the things that you can do with strings. And you can just click and just read a paragraph about each of these to know what they are. You can read about different data types, so you can read about datetime, calendars, heap queue, bisect, etc., etc. Numeric and mathematical modules, file and dictionary access, or rather directory access, data persistence, data compression and archiving. So for example, here you can work with zip files, different file formats, operating system services like creating your own threads, communicating with different processes, internet data handling. For example, this JSON module might be quite useful to you because this is a very common way to interact with websites in terms of getting information in and out of the website, and so forth. So just spend some time reading over the built-in library documentation to familiarize yourself simply with what exists. It's not important to know how it works. You can dive into the details and understand how it works when you need it. But if you don't know that it exists, what might happen is that you might end up trying to re-implement functionality that already somebody else has implemented. And so it's useful to just spend a little bit of time to know what things exist should you need them. Thanks a lot for listening, and good luck with your development projects.